Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle, and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also check out the podcast on Google, Apple, and Spotify, as well as other podcast software. You can also check me out on twitch.tv/ScuttleLemur. I haven't been on there in a couple weeks due to the way my schedule's been worked out, but hopefully I'll be on there again in the near future, hopefully by the end of the week, and that is at twitch.tv/ScuttleLemur. You can also check us out on patreon.com/SonicCinema, and I'm going to be doing some brief write-ups on older movies I see for the first time. This month I'm going to do a bit of a discussion on science fiction, why it is kind of my favorite film genre, as well as some other things. So that is at patreon.com/SonicCinema. Today we are going to be looking at two of the films of the filmmaker Terrence Malick. He was one of the filmmakers that came out of the 70s era, and he's been back pretty prolifically for the past couple of decades. And we're going to be talking about two of his films from the past decade, 2011's The Tree of Life and 2019's A Hidden Life. Joining me on the podcast today is the host of Snarky Faith. He's been on the podcast before. We've talked about Christian cinema, The Omega Code, The Passion of the Christ, and Dogma. Please join me in welcoming back to the program Stuart Delony. Thank you very much for joining me.
Great to be here, Brian.
I love that we're talking about two films who really have nothing to do. Well, first of all, before we get to the films, how are things over at Snarky Faith right now?
Things are going fine. The ship is sailing quite well with Snarky Faith, and there's always plenty of insanity within Christianity and religion. So I think we've always got stuff to skewer. So we're loaded up for a while here.
Well, I will say this is certainly a change of pace for us in terms of our discussions, because when we were talking about Christian cinema, we were talking about a lot of fairly terrible movies. Although we got a chance to talk about The Passion of the Christ, which depending on your perspective on the film can be either a really good film or a really
it's torture porn.
Yeah, torture porn film. And then we talked about Dogma, which had a giant poop monster in it, but has a lot to say about theology and religion. Today's filmmaker, Terrence Malick, is somebody who I think he embodies in ways that very few filmmakers do, a look at the spiritual without being religious. I mean, I do think there's certainly some religious undertones in his films. Even something like The Thin Red Line, which was his first movie after 20 years. His first two features, Badlands and Days of Heaven, which came out in the 70s, are much more in keeping of that 70s aesthetic of films. And even though you can tell that some of his overall visual ideas are in there, they're much more narrative-based than a lot of his work in the past 20-plus years. Starting with The Thin Red Line and going to The New World, Tree of Life, and the film that the other film we're going to be talking about, which is A Hidden Life. What I know, and part of the reason I had the idea of bringing you on to talk about Malick's films is because I was listening back to our discussion on Snarky Faith, and you brought up The Tree of Life, and what is it about as somebody with a religious background and a religious background from an upbringing perspective as well as a scholarly perspective, what is it about a movie like The Tree of Life that sort of embodies ideas of spirituality compared to a movie that just directly approaches religion?
Yeah, like kind of like a God's Not Dead 12 or whatever we're up to now. I mean, like one of those. Yeah, I mean, I feel like the difference, it's a good point that you bring that up. The difference between like religion and spirituality has a lot to do with certainty. And I feel like when you dip your toes in with Malick, certainty is not necessarily the first thing that you're going for. I think the way he handles stuff, and which is why I appreciate this, is he handles it very openly. He handles it almost like in a poetic manner. It's like art. How is this going to speak to you spiritually? We're not going to bash you over the head. We're not going to give you the answer. We're going to make you work for it. And you're going to have to kind of just see what draws into you. He uses so many different things like nature and other stuff to tap into that well. Also with this.
Yeah. It's been actually, I'll admit, it's been a long road for me to sort of get into Malick. I saw Badlands very early on in my education of really becoming much more of a moviegoer, much more into classic movies. And last time I saw Badlands was in like the late 90s, and I really liked it. Days of Heaven was one that just bounced off of me.
Yep. It was one of the same experience. Days of Heaven was my first one, and I was like, supposed to be great, and I did not know what to do with it. And some of that was I think used to being spoon-fed things, cinema-wise in many ways.
Yeah, I rewatched it earlier. I rewatched Days of Heaven earlier this year, and it connected with me a little bit more, but I still am not as enamored with it as a lot of people are. I think it's a gorgeous movie to watch, but narratively, it just doesn't really connect as strongly as I think some of his other stuff does.
No, I would agree with that one. This one, like, I think when I first taste it was not a good taste. But I think my second ended up being Tree Fly. I think I did my toes back in until this point. When it was it 2011? That one Tree Fly. Yeah. So I think that's actually for my second taste of Malick, and I've enjoyed subsequent tastes.
Did you see The Tree of Life in theaters?
No, I did not. I wish I would have. I visually, I think it would be quite amazing in the theater in my mind. Like IMAX or something.
Yeah, I did see it in theaters. I saw it at the Terrace Cinema downtown Atlanta, and it was a movie that I really liked. I certainly think I appreciate it more than the other Malick films I had seen, and I had seen his other films like Badlands, Days of Heaven, then Thin Red Line, and The New World before Tree of Life came out. But it just didn't, for some reason, and I think it was because of it's because of the way he shoots films and the way he tells his stories in a much more oblique and elliptical form, I guess. I mean, his structure is very, I mean, I can't say it's necessarily, it's hard to say that he's structureless because I don't necessarily think that's true, especially after rewatching The Tree of Life recently. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think a lot of his films, they're going for something a bit more vague, I guess, and really trying to capture, like you were saying in his, like you were saying when you were talking about his films, like he's very much into nature. He's very much into capturing. The way he approaches the spiritual is very much from a visual sense as well as a musical sense. That's one of the things that really I actually explored that for patrons last year in a little audio essay on the soundtracks of Terrence Malick, and it's in his films. And one of the things that's always kind of interesting to me, and we can certainly talk about it here as well, when people think of the auteur theory, they naturally think of the French New Wave and how those critics, Truffaut, Godard, they basically came up with this idea that the director's the author of the film. I mean, to a certain extent, that's not inherently wrong, but at the same time, there are other filmmakers that don't really have a personal stamp to their work, that you can't really say that about. But Terrence Malick, I think, is a filmmaker that very much fits in the auteur theory. Especially if you look at the images, you look at the cinematography, you look at the variety of cinematographers he's worked with, as well as the variety of composers, I think he's so much guiding the way the music sounds in his films, as well as the way obviously the images work.
No, he does it. He does it like a. What I want to say is, because you were saying that there are boundaries. I feel like they're just loose boundaries.
Yeah.
On like the narratives, I feel like he gives the visuals like some leash to like run a little bit here and there, and being playful with some of those things. I think giving us also, like the viewers, like some leash to kind of. It feels like a contemplative space.
Yeah.
A lot of what he does, because of the slowness of it. Like I could see where this movie would frustrate people. Definitely, if you're not expecting this, because this definitely feels like very meditative, very contemplative. Let's sit back and see how does this speak to me and my soul when I'm doing this, versus just what am I seeing him telling me?
Yeah.
So I feel like there's more interaction in a certain sense.
Oh, absolutely. And the filmmaker I always compare Malick to is actually one of my very favorite filmmakers of all time, Andrei Tarkovsky. And if you look at Andrei Rublev, if you look at Stalker, if you look at Mirror, which just entered the Criterion Collection this past summer, you see the same type of visually minded levels of spirituality and approaching nature from a spiritual place, as opposed to trying to get to point A to point B to point C. Even in his most structured narratives like Solaris, Tarkovsky's always going for something that is challenging for the audience from on a narrative level, as well as is not afraid to keep us at a distance emotionally if he feels like that's where we need to sort of meet him halfway as audience to director.
And what also feels like with that, I think him creating space, it draws lines that he wouldn't have drawn.
Yeah.
Like I am able to like watch this and think of like my father, during these ages, thinking of this, or you think of myself when I was that age, running around, being like a goofy little kid that was pent up with emotions and hormones and all that stuff. I can think in my head as I watch this and watching like the strained like father-son relationship in this, and I go to places in my head naturally. And so in that way, it like creates almost like new worlds within me that he had no idea that I was going to pull this out of it. So I think there is a playful nature to that he invites us into.
Yeah, and the way we get the narrative structure of Tree of Life, if one such exists, and I do think it does. Yeah. It starts out with it introduces us to the era of where Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain are a married couple. They have children, and there's a tragedy, and that tragedy basically informs them going forward. And then we also see glimpses of Sean Penn, who is the older sibling, and we see how he is sort of disillusioned in his life, and we also see how he's sort of contemplative about the nature of existence. And then, of course, we have a scene which is justly famous and really should have been Oscar nominated for Best Visual Effects and probably should have won. Rewatching it, a scene showing the beginning of creation. And I love that before we get back into the more conventional narrative of the O'Brien family, starting with Jack, the older son's birth, and going from there until we basically reach a point in the movie that I don't think I fully appreciate as much when I was watching it the first time in theaters and just looking as a critic. but we come to a moment where Dad, played by Brad Pitt, has to make a choice of whether they're going to stay and he's just going to lose his job, or he's going to have to take a worse job and move. And it's funny because last week was my birthday, and or last week from when we were recording this was my birthday, and one of the things I talked about that day in terms of my life was what was like thinking about when we moved down to Georgia from Ohio. And that really had a profound impact on me because that was the only life I had ever known. And ultimately, they were doing it not just for his job, but also, and they kept trying to say it's for your benefit too, because of the fact that it's like it's good schools and it's a good area, and it's like they were looking at it as more opportunities, and they ended up it ended up being correct, but I didn't know that until years later. And so I think rewatching it, this was my first time watching it for the first time in I think 10 years. I don't think I'd seen it since theaters. That connection really hit me. And also, I mean, at the time that The Tree of Life had come out, I hadn't lost my father yet. And I think so I hadn't had that reflection on our relationship growing up as I have in the past few years. And it's just, it's one of the late great Roger Ebert said this so beautifully, and he was talking mainly about La Dolce Vita, but I know The Tree of Life really affected him, and he had this great movies bi-weekly series that he did for the last 15, 17 years of his life, and I look at The Tree of Life as sort of like the last unofficial entry he made to that, because he added The Tree of Life to his 10 best lists that he submitted to Sight and Sound on their decade best films of all times lists. And he wrote beautifully about that experience of talking of like how to approach that list. And one of the things he said was, like, once a movie's on this list for him, it's canon. It's part of the pantheon. And the fact that he decided that Tree of Life was going to be the last one that he added to that list, it speaks highly to how it impacted him. And it's now that I've seen it again, older and more contemplative about my overall life, it's easier to appreciate now than it did then.
Yeah, it is interesting about how, especially in movies like this that are very much, I know I'm not trying to get back into talking about the narrative of it, because what he did was he picked out interesting snippets, I thought, of life and childhood, that were very universal. Even in the fact of, like, as we grow older and as our fathers grow older in this, and as you have been through your father's passing, we're able to see them in different ways. And even, like, I love, there's a scene where Brad Pitt is talking to his son about just kind of all of his life and his failed dreams.
Yeah.
And it's such a simple scene, but it's also very crushing, because it's a very human scene to be able to know that going on there. And then leading me back to thinking about, well, now I'm a father. Like, where have I, like, what are those moments? What are those moments of where I have not been at my best? Where are those moments where I am with my kids? Because it's easy for me to see it still through the eyes of a child, but then I also start saying, like, well, gosh, which character would I be more? Because the whole idea of setting this up, I think, in a biblical narrative somewhat, it's that, I mean, he talks about this in the movie, this nature versus grace, kind of this kind of, like, it really feels like judgment versus grace. I mean, it's almost like you could over spiritualize this and kind of say that it's the father is more like Old Testament God, the mother is more like a Jesus type character where she's about grace and love and compassion, and the father is just harsh and smacks the kids. But I don't know. I feel like maybe those were some of the efforts in that. I don't know if it was just masculinity in that time period and femininity in that time period also. of themes that he's playing with.
Well, and I mean, I definitely think, you know, it's like one of the things I wrote down was nature versus nurture. This whole idea of, you know, which is how most of us would look at it. I mean, yes, he talks about grace a lot, and it's completely befitting the more spiritual and religious nature, because he opens with a quote from Job, the book of Job in this, and but yeah, the idea that the father is the dominant one, the father's the one who sets the rules, the father's the one who basically, this is my household, this is how my household's going to be, and the mother is more caring towards them, more forgiving towards them. And I mean, you know, it's like it basically this is something that no doubt is born out of Malick's memories of growing up.
Yeah.
And you know, the movie is such a beautiful film. It's shot by Emmanuel Lubezki, who is whose nickname is Chivo. He should have won the Oscar for cinematography for this. This was a stunning accomplishment. He's since won a couple of others. So, but the fact that his camera is so his camera just flows. His camera just moves effortlessly, and it's something you see in other Malick films as well. I mean, this is where I think Malick as an auteur really comes alive, because you look at you think back to images John Toll shot for The Thin Red Line, or and I mean Lubezki was basically Malick's cinematographer from The New World to Song to Song, which was his most his film previous to A Hidden Life. And you just look at the fact that I love that camera is always moving, and the camera is always moving in interesting ways, but doesn't feel jarring. I think that's one of the things that's kind of surprising, and that's one of the things that kind of can throw an audience off when it comes to Malick, is the fact that his camera is arguably moving as quickly as any Michael Bay film. But the way
that's a good point. Yes,
the way he edits it, and the way that it's moving in context of the narrative, is what makes it much more interesting to watch, and much more contemplative too.
Yeah, in one sense, it seems like you're either like in a dream or like a vision, where it's just kind of reality feels like it's moving a bit, but part of it also just makes you feel like you're there. He has this amazing ability to capture the ordinariness in life in a way that feels very truthful. It's kind of like the anti like Norman Rockwell kind of. I don't know. I feel like Norman Rockwell is very posed in like Americana. I feel like this is just very like naturalistic, what like 1950s Americana looked like. Because how beautiful are Brad Pitt and Jessica Chastain in this? And they're like picture perfect in how they filmed this with him and his crew cut. And I'm just like this. Yeah. They embody that very well.
And it's interesting because of the fact that, like, I think the first time I saw it, I didn't necessarily recognize Pitt and Chastain as characters. I didn't necessarily, and I think that's one of the things that sort of could throw a first timer off if you're not attuned to Malick and you haven't necessarily seen his films before, so you're not necessarily aware of how he tells stories, that they almost feel like, I guess, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the best word to describe it. They feel like sort of placeholders, or I guess they're almost like characters.
They're almost like monolithic, or like they're, because I feel like it's like from the perspective of a kid and how you see your parents.
Yeah.
I mean, but you're right about that too. That they also are they're very much drawn in a certain way.
But that type of ideas, and the idea of monolithic and statuesque, I think is a good way. Basically, they're the child's perspective on what their parents were like, but not quite. Sort of like how we imagine our parents like when we're that young, but not necessarily without necessarily that humanity that they really have, that we don't really come to appreciate until we grow as we grow older.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And
with that, I think that like. Oh, also, did you? I know I didn't notice this first time. I didn't even notice this until like later in the film. Did you notice who the little brother was?
It was Ty Sheridan, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I was like, who is? Yeah, it was Ty Sheridan.
Yeah, it's his first
Ready
film.
Player One, etc.
Yeah.
Is that his? Okay, I didn't. It took me a while to hone in on him. The second time watching it, I wouldn't have known who he was the first time.
Yeah,
but.
Yeah, Ty Sheridan from Ready Player One and a bunch of other stuff, but I was surprised how much, it's like I'm somebody who we don't have kids, but I mean we have cats, but we don't have kids. We have a lot of nieces and nephews, so it's like seeing them grow up is kind of that's kind of where we are with regards to that. So the thing that connected with me so much more this time was just realizing that this is it's essentially a memory piece. It reminds me, and it does actually, in a lot of ways, it does remind me of Tarkovsky's Mirror, which is very much a memory piece of Tarkovsky's childhood, but in a very, we talk about how vague and how vague the narrative can be with Malick. It's even more so in Mirror, in Tarkovsky's film. It's still a beautiful film if you get a chance to watch it, but it's a challenging film. But I think ultimately both filmmakers have their hearts in the right place, and in terms of what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. As I'm somebody who I'm a film score buff. I have been for about almost 30 years at this point. And the way Malick uses music in this is interesting because of the fact that it's usually sort of like with Kubrick. It's a combination of classical music as well as original score. And this time the score is composed by Alexandre Desplat, who's become a wildly well-acclaimed composer. He did some of the Harry Potter movies. He's done a lot of Wes Anderson's work. He also did the Godzilla reboot Warner Brothers did several years ago. He's done a wide variety of stuff, and it's been great to hear him grow as a composer. And it's one of those things where you almost wonder to a certain extent how a composer feels when they're having to share the sonic landscape with classical music. But I feel like if you're a composer and you're going to a Terrence Malick film, you kind of know that that's kind of going to be the case right off the bat. And what he does is very beautiful. It's really, it captures your memory. It captures the imagination, the visual style of what you're looking at, as much as the classical music that he uses as well.
No, it's very beautiful, and how it pairs well. Like I would be almost curious, because I would think like scoring a normal film, the beats are a lot simpler. Like you kind of know what you're going for in a traditional narrative, to where this is almost like, I feel like he's giving even the composer space, but like giving him like, I'm wanting these emotions, these feelings, I'm wanting some of this and that. But like I would almost think that in many ways this would be very. It seems like they would work a lot hand in hand doing this because of the vast space that you're offering a composer, and you're not necessarily nailing them down to like, this is suspense, this is this. I feel like you're drawing a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, it's like, because he's worked with a number of really terrific composers. Days of Heaven was scored by Ennio Morricone. Thin Red Line was scored by Hans Zimmer. New World was scored by James Horner, and then Hidden Life has a score by James Newton Howard, and we'll talk about that one a little bit when we get to Hidden Life. And I love. It's always been kind of interesting to hear composers talk about their experiences. I think especially, I know James Horner. I think he kind of had a rough time with Malick, even though it's probably one of my favorite scores of his. And it's still very much resolutely a James Horner score, but also fits within the larger framework of the music that Malick inspires in his films. But I think somebody like Zimmer and Desplat, who very much are more experimental, or more interested in mood, are more interested in capturing an sense of atmosphere more than that goes with emotion, as opposed to big thematic writing. I think this type of thing works beautifully for them, and I mean, you can definitely hear that in this score.
No, it pairs so well with the things, like even thinking about the whole creation narrative. It's kind of, I don't know if it's the middle, but it feels like it's kind of in the center-ish of the film. Yeah, and it to me, I felt like that almost was rivaling like Space Odyssey. Is what it brought me back to at the beginning of it. Even the music and how powerful all that was. I can't imagine. You're right. The film would have been different in the hands of a different composer.
Yeah.
For better or worse. But it is interesting about how much of a role that the music played in this, because it's between all the spaces, because there's not a lot of talking.
Well, it's funny because there is a lot of talking in terms of the voiceover.
Yeah, the narration.
There's a lot of voiceover, so you hear a lot of talking. You just don't hear a lot of scenes being played out in the conventional way that we're used to. I mean, that was something that I went back and reread my initial review of the movie, and it's like I wasn't a big fan of that, because it's like it kind of hit me the wrong way in Thin Red Line. It kind of hit me the wrong way with the New World, and it kind of hit me the wrong way here. But rewatching it, like it's absolutely the best way to approach it. And I mean, I think because of the fact that it has been easier for me to notice. It's easier for me to notice now how much more structure is in this movie than I initially thought it was. And it's funny, you were talking about the creation scene, and that's actually what I was going to get to next, because you can't, and it's funny, I didn't mention in my written review, but you can't really talk about The Tree of Life without talking about this amazing, like, I don't know, 10, 15-minute sequence at least of essentially showing the creation of the universe. And it's as bold as the Ray of Spring sequence in Fantasia and how it does that. It's one of the visual effects artists is the legendary Douglas Trumbull, who is best known for his work on 2001 as well as Blade Runner. So the comparison to 2001 is completely appropriate. And it is just, it's such a breathtaking, naturalistic look at the beginning of the universe. And the way that I would love to watch a behind the scenes on how they conceptualize this, how they decide to visualize this, because it's some of the most remarkable effects work I've ever seen, and it's also based out of a naturalistic view of the world too. And the dinosaurs in this movie just look absolutely stunning. They don't do a lot of what we're used to in the Jurassic movies, but they don't need to. It's funny because of the fact that while I think they probably look more realistic than the dinosaurs in the Jurassic movies, in a way they're also impressionistic because of the fact that everything in that sequence you can tell it's something that is you would see in the real world. And they basically, and the dinosaurs don't do much. They basically kind of just stand off in the distance, or they come up close, or they are just laying on the ground. And so they're not necessarily doing anything. They're just there. And it's really it's really just a wonderful it's really just a wonderful evocative use of visual effects and to tell this story.
Well, and what's interesting is I know that this would probably this vision of probably creation would probably piss off a lot of evangelicals or conservatives. But I think, like, for me, like, it wasn't, for me in my faith and spirituality, I was like, I think this is beautiful, and I think that this speaks to a higher level of creativity and beauty that is happening. You know, so for me, it wasn't something that I was like, oh no, my faith. No, I could appreciate it completely because I'm seeing what's happening here.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it meant this, and I don't know if I'm pulling too much threads, because it almost seemed like we were moving from like ocean and water to land and how things progress, and then we kind of move back to the ocean with Sean Penn towards the end.
Yeah.
Because I think he's in the desert and it's dry, and then we eventually kind of move back out to that. So I don't know if that was intentional, that there's a symmetry there, or if it was just accidental with that. But.
With Malick, I would completely imagine there's a symmetry. And actually, no, I mean, I think with Malick, it's got to be completely symmetrical. The idea of beginning in a certain place, moving to another area, and then continuing there. And it's interesting because of the fact that I do think we start off in this very desolate landscape when we get to the beginning of the beginning of nature and animals coming into nature in that sequence, and then it's basically another desolate landscape by the time at the end, which we've sort of foreshadowed in the earlier scene with Sean Penn. It's essentially, I know in my initial review I likened it to sort of like Malick's interpretation of the rapture, of what certain Christians think of in terms of the rapture, but I mean, really, you could just look at it as the afterlife in general. And
or you're like a Lord of the Rings. We're on a boat. We're going off now.
Yeah,
see you guys.
Exactly.
I mean, like an easy afterlife. Yeah.
It's fascinating to see just how much, and yeah, I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from when it comes to, like, most Christians would just be completely turned off and would be horrified by the idea of creation, sort of like what they kind of were during the scene in Fantasia when they did that during the Rite of Spring. And it's funny because I actually I picked up the Criterion for this because of the fact that I wanted to watch the extended version of the Tree of Life.
How much longer is it?
It's like 50 minutes longer. And one of the things, yeah. And so one of the things, I will admit, it's not a director's cut in the traditional sense. It's basically just, and I mean, even Malick said that the version that came out in theaters is his sort of definitive version of the movie. The extended version is just something he did for Criterion. I mean, they actually put up the money to produce it. So, so it's specifically on that disc. But the thing that was so interesting, I just watched it in preparation today for the podcast because I'd never seen it before. Most of it is just expanding on the scenes that are there. You do see a lot more. You do see a lot more of the effect scenes and stuff like that for the creation sequence, and you get a lot more scenes of them of the kids and of that big chunk from when Jack is born, basically to the very end of the movie. You basically get big chunks of scenes that were deleted from the original version, and they bring a little bit more fullness to the sense of a life being lived. that part admittedly meanders, but one of the things that I love about the film, that version in general, is that it's 3 hours, and you were right to go, oh my God, an extra hour of this movie. But at the same time, you don't necessarily feel that, especially in the first hour, because you can tell that he's bringing in other scenes, but they're so well edited together, and the continuity is just so strong in terms of the way he's pacing it that you don't really notice. And it's not until he starts to bring in many more scenes, many more moments, that we start to see, okay, yeah, I kind of see where I see where he's going with this, but at the same time, it's kind of it feels a bit too much. It's still an interesting idea. If you do have the Criterion and you haven't checked it out, it's worth checking out. It's the theatrical one is the superior version, and it's good to see that Malick feels that way too, and that this was basically sort of, I guess, an experiment that Criterion decided to do for this particular film.
No, that's good. Now, would you say, like, do you feel like when you look at the two, are they almost two different things now with adding that extra 50 minutes, or do they feel very different, like, as a whole?
I wouldn't say it's not drastic. It's not so drastically different. It's essentially the same movie. It's essentially saying the same type of things. There's just more of the footage. It's basically just more footage of it. I mean, I do think, it's... And if you prefer the longer version, I completely understand that. I personally don't. I think the second and third hours do kind of drag a bit, which I don't necessarily feel happens in the theatrical version. I think it's... I think he made the choices he made in terms of editing some of these for a reason. Because some, like, we do see in the extended version, we do see extended scenes of the kids playing and Jack sort of rebelling against what his father has shown him. And I don't feel like you need as much of that as you get in the extended version. And you also see the tragedy of the boy dying in the pool. And I feel like I understand from an impact standpoint, but at the same time, I think it doesn't need to be. I think the pain and the sadness of how that basically hangs over everything is told so beautifully in just the moments that we get in the theatrical.
So it almost just sounds like these are just different experiences, what you're stepping into.
Yeah.
It's kind of like different experiences, which is very, again, like his nature is very, he's a very contemplative storyteller. And so I guess it's just how much space do you want to give him? How much contemplation do you want to give him? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, if you're looking at this from the perspective of this is essentially a memory piece that Malick is creating from his childhood, he's just sharing more memories for you. That's basically what it is. Up in that part of the movie, in the earlier parts, it's like, I actually like what he did. I like the little bits they did add into it. I think it would have been interesting to see him, the trim version of what we see in the main crux of the story with like that first 40, 50 minutes or so that's expanded. It would have been interesting to see how those two worked, but I mean, I'm perfectly fine having one as one and the other because of the fact that it's like, extended editions and director's cuts can be tricky because, I mean, a good one I would compare this to is Apocalypse Now, where it's like the theatrical version itself is brilliant. Just alone is fantastic. You look at Apocalypse Now Redux, where Coppola was like, oh, we're going to add all this stuff back in. And it's like, well, that's fine. except some of it just doesn't quite work as well as I think you want it to. And so when he did the final cut of Apocalypse Now, it came out a couple of years ago, and you can buy it, and it's all 3 different versions on the same set. You know, I finally watched the final cut last year, and it was a nice mixture of both previous versions, where it's like it doesn't go so far as Redux, but also keeps a lot of the same pacing and nature of what the theatrical is.
No, I think that's fast. It's always interesting when people have to go back and to like an old canvas and kind of replay around with it and whether it makes it better or not. I mean, you know, we're not all Zack Snyder. And no.
There's so much to talk about with that.
I know. Sorry.
Well, and the thing is, it's like there's a lot to talk about with that. And I mean, there's certainly a lot more going on than just the studio wouldn't let me do this. It's like no, there was a lot more going on. You know, ultimately he did get the last laugh because he was able to get his version out there, and honestly, his version is the better one. I still think there are issues with it, but it's the better one. You know, I mean, I think if you're looking at the 2 versions of Tree of Life, I think it's more of, you know, it's more of a Lord of the Rings situation where it's like you're adding a little bit more to the story. Both versions are great. It just depends. It's like, do you want something that hews even a little bit more closer to the book versus what we got theatrically, which is pretty great in its own right.
No, you're right. It's almost like, I think with Malick, it's kind of like, do you want like a 4-course meal or like a 6-course meal versus Snyder, which is like Wendy's or Taco Bell? Where are we going to go? You know, I feel like there's a little difference in artistry there too, but yeah. Yeah.
Oh, no, to be sure. You know, it's like I have so many mixed feelings on Zack Snyder. I mean, again, I'm glad he was able to finish his version of the movie. I have my issues with it, but I mean, I also recognize that it is a better version of that same story. But you know, it's I mean, it's a really, you know, going back to Tree of Life, you know, looking at some of my notes, he's you know, the way he does the creation scene is just so it's those effects are not going to age. Those effects are like the effects that Trumbull did in 2001, where they're so photorealistic, they're just not going to age. But they're also very impressionistic as well. And I mean, you know, because you look at the Stargate scene, and it's like that's not a scene in reality. But at the same time, that scene is timeless because it's showing us something genuinely original. And I think that's certainly the case with the creation scenes in this one as well. The way he adds that scene of creation in between, and it's funny because it really only happens in like the half-hour mark of the movie. Because I thought, from my memory, it was closer to halfway too.
Okay.
And I was stunned when I watched the theatrical the other day. It's like, wow, I don't remember this sequence being as early in the film as it is. But it does actually mark a halfway point in the more impressionistic scenes at the beginning that sort of set the stage for what we're going to see later. Yeah. And so it's basically, in that way, it's actually a perfect bridge because of the fact that you're looking at, you know, before creation, you're looking at a semblance of the universe, but without really being able to define it. And then later on, the narrative feels much more defined, much more point A to point B to point C, even though it still very much feels in tune of people of somebody remembering those experiences.
It's interesting that you said that because it popped some ideas in my head when thinking about this, because I know he starts the movie with a quote from the book of Job. And I know a lot of this is oriented a bit around the book of Job, some of the idea, because Job is considered one of the oldest books in the Bible because nobody knows when it was written. Mm-hmm. Depending on who you ask, it's not considered to be literal, but more of a metaphorical story about Job, who is a good man, who the devil's like, oh, everyone likes you, God, unless life's going bad for them. And God's like, what about Job? And he's like, the devil's like, okay, I'm going to make crap happen to him and let's see what happens. So then Job's like loses his family, he loses everything, and all of his friends are coming by to him, like 3 different friends come by to him, and they're kind of like, what did you do? Just go ahead and curse God and die. Like you must have sinned. You must have done something bad here. And I feel like that's picking into some of this whole idea that I think Malick is pulling at this idea that life is inherently loss, that there is loss is like a part of life. And then so Job doesn't in the story, Job doesn't ever say, oh God, you suck, I hate you. But Job starts questioning God. And so the whole end of Job is God kind of being like, hey, where were you before I created the earth? Where were you when I made this? Where were you when I made this? And so it's almost like they're relating some of that whole narrative between Job and this hypothetical conversation with God. I think it fits into that about finding, if life is full of loss, how do we find meaning in the midst of it? If life is hard, how do we continue to find hope and grace in that? Because in this movie, there's the death of children. How do you move on after that? There's the death of, it's difficult, but I feel like that also anchors him to being very human too. So I think his spiritual nature anchors him to being very openly human in this. And I think that makes it very accessible for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's sort of what makes this is a movie where you almost do need to see it a second time. And ultimately you shouldn't have to see movies twice. You should be able to get what you're trying to get out, what the filmmaker is trying to get you to think about once. But the fact is there is value in repeat viewings. And especially with a movie like The Tree of Life, and I know one of the things that I really appreciate about this one, not only because of the fact that I'm in a different place in my life than I was 10 years ago, but because of the fact that it makes you think of it makes you think about life in terms of, well, if life is hard, how do you react to that? What do you make of your life? What do you make of yourself if all you know is pain and sadness and difficulty? Like, how do you get past that? And I think that's ultimately one of the great challenges of life is, what do we do when life gives us, it goes back to, it goes back to the idea of well, if God's so good, why do good people die? And it's it's a very simplistic way of putting it, but at the same time, it's like, if God is so good, why do good people seem to have difficult times? And it's well, I mean, unfortunately, that's the nature of life. That's the nature of existence. But it's what you do. That's where it really challenges you, and that's actually a perfect segue into our second film, which shows that in as direct a way as Malick has ever approached it in his 2019 film A Hidden Life, which is based upon the life of Franz Jagerstatter, an Austrian farmer who, during World War II, was called up to fight for Nazi Germany, and he refused to swear an oath in allegiance to Hitler. He had previously served in the army, but when he came back, he realized that he couldn't do that again. So when they try to bring him back up a second time, he refuses, and he goes to prison. it ostracizes his family from their community, and he was eventually tried and executed. And he has since become a he has since become revered for being a conscientious objector. And this movie, this was the first time Malick really connected with me in a truly profound way. I saw this film I actually saw this film on a studio screener because it didn't really come out in Atlanta. And I saw it in January of 2020. I was going through a difficult time with regards to my mom and her health. And it was one of those things where it was really challenging me. It was really, how do I make what I feel like needs to happen? And how do I stay true to my convictions in this moment? And Jagerstatter's story just connected with me completely, and Malick's approach to the story just was so beautiful and just completely was what I needed at the time, which I'd never really experienced in a Malick film before. This is I've seen it a couple of times since. I personally, I love The Ambition of Tree of Life. It is a wonderful film. I definitely appreciate it much more now than I did in 2011, but I do think A Hidden Life is probably his best film.
No, I think it's his best impulses, but it's also probably constraining some of his impulses too, to stick to a narrative. So, but I think because of that, I think it is a very worthy challenge, and I think that you have a very good point about this is kind of you seeing somebody finally getting all the pieces like right, like a lot of what they've been trying to do, and they somehow finally he's hit it, because you're right. We were talking about this whole huge story about the war, but it's really just about Franz and Fanny, his wife. I mean, it's so small and so intimate, but it's so human. And at the time it came out, I don't know. I'm curious about what were his impulses. Was he just telling the story around this time period for funsies, or did it hits a lot with a lot of the rise of nationalism and stuff when it came out? I was just kind of going like, whoo.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because of the fact that I was actually going to bring that up, and it's interesting because the two films that Searchlight had that winter, Fox Searchlight, now Searchlight, had that winter that could have been awards contenders were this and Jojo Rabbit. And it's interesting because of the fact that both of them are essentially about standing up to the ugly reality of the Nazis and realizing, wait a minute, what they're telling me is bullshit. And it's like, this is not how this is at all. I mean, now the way I enjoy Jojo Rabbit, it's a fun movie. Taika Waititi does a really great job with it. It's also fairly slight. It doesn't. Now, I do think it has some profound things to say, but also saying them with regards to in the realm of like dark comedy in a way. Yeah. A Hidden Life is taking a real life, and it's funny because of the fact that you don't really get a reference to the Holocaust or what's going on with the Jews at all. He just he objects to what the Nazi Party is at its core, and the fact that we don't get the moralizing of what they're doing to the Jewish people in life is fascinating because of how effective the film's message ultimately remains.
Yes, I mean, I think you're on point with that, especially when we're able to, in many ways, just see it. With films like this, it's always interesting when you're able to see how this is like a story about history, but it's also like a story about just like a small little bit of history.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the small plant on the side of like a mountain kind of story of that. Because you're right, because we don't see the horrors of war. I think that he uses like an old like war propaganda to kind of give us hints of what Hitler's doing and other things of that nature. But really, you're right. It's from a very small, narrow perspective. And you're right. It has less to do about how horrible Hitler is and how we know the fullness of how horrible Hitler was. This is more just from a standpoint of someone being able to say is that I always felt like when he was almost to this point of, if I acquiesce, if I just fold over like everyone else has done, does that make me less of myself?
Right.
You know, because I feel like a lot of it for Fanny was like she knew that's who he was. Yeah. She knew that like for him to make a different decision would make him not the man that she loved, so many times, which is tragic.
And there are so many times where she could have said, I need you at home. I cannot live without you. You need to do this. She is behind him 100%. And that courage of conviction on her part is as vital as his in the movie.
Oh yes, for being a widow in that time period, also like having a farm, like because later in the movie when he's in jail, they're showing all the work that she's doing and how exhausted she is, and trying to hold it all together. Like she holds, I feel like in many ways he goes through prison, but she holds a lot more of the cultural weight and being kicked around, kind of more than he does. I mean, you expect it in prison, but it's also like the things. These are people we knew in community that are now shunning us.
And that's the other part where it's like she's having to do so much work because of the fact that the people in her community despise her and despise them because they're not going with what society tells them that they need to be going with, which is just, you're an Austrian citizen. This is what you need to do for your homeland. And it's like, no, that's not what we need to do. And it's like, it's funny because of the fact that it's like we got, a few years ago, it's like we've talked about Mel Gibson, but we got Hacksaw Ridge a few years ago, which was about different type of conscientious objector. He is fine going off to war. He just won't shoot anybody. And it's like that story, it's a really good story, but it's not at the same time. Yes, you're committed to not killing anybody. You're also willing to be a part of a machine that is killing people, though. And so that level of commitment, there's a disconnect there. I mean, I think the thing that makes Franz so inspiring is the fact that he had so many opportunities where he could, and he had leaders in the community who were telling him, just do this. This is what you need to do. And he just refuses. And it's interesting because the Franz is played by August Diehl in this. If you've seen him before, it's funny because you've seen him, you most likely have seen him as the Nazi officer who finds out the bastards in the bar scene in Inglourious Bastards. So it's interesting to see him play a character who's so resolutely on the opposite side of that moral coin in this movie.
No, it's with morality and too, and I like what he does. Speaking with morality about how Malick is also, he uses this film as like an affront against the church during the time.
Yeah.
I mean, because again, like one of the first people that we see Franz goes to is his priest. And the priest is like, what did he say? I was writing this. Your sacrifice will benefit no one.
Yeah.
That's that, and then he goes, then eventually he goes to the bishop, And then the bishop just ends up quoting scripture and saying, you have duty to the fatherland, which is kind of like a Romans 13, like just do whatever they're doing. But you see how feckless and spineless the church in Germany was. And so there's a whole like layer of hypocrisy to this, that he has more. This guy standing for one simple idea that they don't even portray him being overly religious.
No.
They don't, I mean, he seems to be, venerable, and he cares about his community and his church, but he doesn't seem to be an overly religious person, but he is a person that at this point is like, I can't. Like, I just, there's that line and I can't cross it.
Yeah. No, it's remarkable, and I think who does he play?
I just kept expecting at some point for them to come out with like MIGA hats, like what is it, Make Germany Great Again hats or something like. But it very much felt like that, like in what we've been through over the last while. And I don't know if he was trying to pull some of this, because I know there's correlations to what happened.
Right.
But at the same time, I can't tell if. I don't know that Malick would be winking about that, because I have no idea how long he takes to do his films also. Because there's times.
So the first reports of this film being made were in June of 2016. So it's before.
Okay.
So it's before Trump came to office, but at the same time, you had people recognizing this danger of the rise of white nationalism. And and I mean, we certainly had dealt with 8 years of racism and bigotry rearing its ugly head again during Obama's presidency. And so the idea that, I mean, he would probably never admit that it's like, oh yeah, this is why I made this movie. But the fact is, it's like, you wouldn't be surprised. It makes sense to a certain extent that he's bringing this movie out at this particular time. And you would imagine, especially with his views in his films on the idea of war and the idea of death, and it's funny because of the fact that there are times where he almost seems to have a bleak nature of humanity, a bleak view of humanity, but at the same time, he also has a lot of grace towards humanity. Yeah. You can understand where he might be inspired by what's happened, what he's noticing in the United States and really around the world happening because of the fact that we've seen a marked increase in white nationalism, in just in fervent
racial violence, exactly. and the rise of all of that too. No, we see that, and what's interesting, I feel like the way he paints the picture is almost the mob is bad, like the individual is good, because there's other people that will agree with him, but in their mind just keep quiet, like just I'm playing it smart. Yeah. I'm playing a smart game. I'm not gonna mention this, or others that are just completely folded over because they're part of like the group mind hive think that they just have to follow this because they buy into the propaganda. For me, this is something like spiritually. I'll just say it's an interesting topic because I feel like growing up, I grew up around a lot of conservative like Southern Baptists, and I remember like there was this whole idea about always like standing up for Jesus, like never like, and you'd have things about people that are persecuted, like in the Middle East or whatever, like they would not renounce their God. You know, like like the movie Silence or something, this idea that you won't renounce this, like there's this huge big idea, and it's held up so high. But when me as a kid, I was always like, well, we all know these people are crazy, right? Yeah. Like so part of me is like, I'm kind of like, I'll live to fight another day because we all know these people are crazy. Like me saying words to crazy people isn't going to fix anything, even though that's me being I'm being more ideological dubious with this. But yes, I love his conviction. My pushback was always like, I always wonder if there was like a different way. Like there were others during the war, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and other people that conspired to try to use things to try to take down the Nazis from within. And I don't know, but this is a film about a small farmer who is probably not going to be getting involved in trying to take anything down. He just knows what is right, and he knows what life is, and he knows the love of his wife and his family, and he just wants to protect that. And I think that's very human.
Yeah, there was a fascinating documentary that came out in May of this year, and it's available for VOD if you're interested in checking it out. It's called Final Count, and it's basically a documentary the filmmaker started in 2008, and it's basically a series of interviews with children with adults who were children during the rise of the Third Reich. And you hear them, they had different parts to play. They were sometimes part of the Hitler Youth, sometimes, and then they would become Nazi officers and stuff like that. And basically hearing their words as spectators of what was going on and the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of the machine that would eventually result in the Holocaust. It's fascinating to hear them talk about that from the inside, from that perspective of just being witnesses to it, as well as growing into people who had to be a part of that because that's how you were. And it's a fascinating documentary. I highly recommend it if you check it. If you're interested in this larger discussion about how this happened in sort of the environment and the conditions that Jagerstatter's life existed in. And it's like he's not quite the same thing because he's in Austria, but at the same time, it's like Hitler was from Austria. So that is where that loyalty came from in that country to be on Germany's side. And, it's like it blows my mind the fact that it's like you have all these people who are basically telling him, and it's like even his lawyers telling him, it's like, look, you can just swear allegiance to it, to him. You can like work in a hospital or something like that. So it's like you're not hurting anybody, but you can. But he is so resolutely against the idea of Hitler in general and what the Nazis are doing. It is so remarkable, and it's like we need to be. I think especially from after the past few years, I think it is good to be reminded of the idea, because of the fact that, this is essentially about one individual taking on a system, even though he really is not, like people tell him, you're essentially not taking on anything, because what he does is not going to stop the Nazis. What he does is not going to stop what the Nazis are doing. But it's that one, it's that act of courage in a world that seems like absolute madness to hold to your guns, to hold to your convictions, that is just so profound. And just that's what connected with me. And Malick's his control of his artistry here is fantastic, because it really is one of the most conventional narratives he's ever told, but he still has room for those. I'm going to use the word poetic linkages, because it's like that's a word that Tarkovsky used in his book. He talks about poetic linkages, which are basically mise-en-scene moments of images and montage that don't necessarily tell a narrative story, but they tell an emotional one. They tell a spiritual one. And something that Tarkovsky did beautifully in everything he does, in everything he did. And it's something that I think Malick really had to have been connected with too, because he does this so well in his best films. And I think the way he does it here, and the use of classical music, along with a score by James Newton Howard, who is one of the more, he's somebody who fans know about. He's done The Fugitive, he's done Dave, he's done comedies, action films, dramas. He co-composed the music for the Dark Knight trilogy, but he also did work for Paul Greengrass for News of the World last year. He did A Hidden Life, and this is one of those things where it's like you have a composer who's very as versatile as Newton Howard, but his work for Malick fits within that larger aesthetic of Malick's work. It fits. You can hear the commonalities in sound and the type of compositions that he's making that you can hear in Desplat's music for Tree of Life, in Hans Zimmer's music for The Thin Red Line, and it's just absolutely beautiful. I love this through line of visual imagination and musical imagination going into Malick's storytelling.
Oh, I feel like the mountains, like in Austria, play like almost a role in themselves. Like the land around it. I mean, it tells so much of the story, whether it be through seasons. Like we see different seasons of them harvesting crops and being able to tell the passage of time. But it's breathtaking where they are. It feels like their own, which I guess is what makes this film even more, in a certain sense, like audacious in the story. It's such a small story, and his character is such a person that's like on the other end of the world. Yeah, like he's not near anything at all, and yet somehow this one little dissenter is being like the thorn in the side of these people, that they care that much. Yeah. To have to go through all this because it's all about control, and that's the way control works. And I don't know if this is like part of this, and I feel like this is very much Malick for both of this, because I remember there's beautiful intimate scenes between him and her a lot of times where they're just kind of laying in a field talking. Yeah. And sometimes it has a deep purpose. Sometimes it's really just a human purpose of just knowing how much they're on the same page and connected. But in one scene, as she says, like, time will come when we know what all of this is for. Mm-hmm. But I feel like that's also like a Tree of Life kind of a thing, like this idea that we may not know what this is for. Yeah. That there's a bigger story that is foretelling here that that yes, he did not know his sacrifice did anything. Franz knew nothing of any of this. Yeah. But yet we are many, many years later talking about his life now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Valerie Packner, who plays his wife, is just they're the her of the movie. And it's great that this has such scope. This has such it's one of those things that I like to call these type of movies intimate epics, where it's like they're tremendous movies of tremendous scope, but tell personal stories. And I mean, this is another thing that connects with me to Tarkovsky. His first two films, Ivan's Childhood and Andrei Rublev, which Andrei Rublev is one of the best movies I've ever seen. It is you can see a lot of the structural challenges that Malick makes, I think, in Andrei Rublev, and it's a wonderful film. It's about, in a way, it's about the Russian icon painter, but not exactly. It's more about the time in which he lived, and that's kind of the same way with A Hidden Life. And it's about, although this one is very much more about Franz's life directly, because Andrei Rublev is kind of an it's more of an invented biopic. It's not a strict biopic in the same way you and I largely consider biopics, but it definitely feels of a piece with this film. A couple of actors, this was their final film. Michael Nyqvist, who plays the bishop in the film, this was his final role. And then the great Bruno Ganz. He plays the magistrate at Friends Tribunal at the very end. And he's a legendary German actor, best known for Wings of Desire, the Wim Wenders film, which is just breathtaking. And then he actually also played Hitler in the movie Downfall, which most people will know because of the memes about Hitler.
Yeah.
Hitler
Nine.
memes.
Yeah.
And he is. I've seen the full movie, and he's tremendous in that movie. But yeah, he is fantastic as the magistrate in this movie. He has scenes of tremendous consequence where he's talking with Franz face to face outside of the courtroom, and it's one of those scenes that you've seen in a dozen other movies and biopics. It's like you have this kind of scene where it's like, just do what we ask you to do. How hard is this? It's like basically trying to convince them, it's like for their own sake, that this is what you need to do. And it's like it's just such a brilliantly played piece by Gans and Deal in this. And I love this film. I'm so glad I would have loved to have seen this on the big screen. I really don't know if it played in Atlanta anywhere theatrically, but I would have loved to have seen this on the big screen because it's a remarkable film, and it is you mentioned the newsreels. It's like that is actually something that kind of remind me, because in Tree of Life, in the extended version, Malick also uses newsreels at times to sort of to put us in the time and place that the movie takes place. And it's really kind of interesting. It was interesting to watch that after because I had forgotten they uses the newsreels in here, but I love it because of the fact that it's such a simple expositional use for the sake of exposition. And it just is, it's like, well, I mean, I don't want to have to recreate all of this stuff, so I'm just going to use newsreels. Yeah. But it's also effective. But it's so effective, and it's such a simple idea. Because I mean, we've no doubt seen. At this point, it's like in this point in history, chances are the rise of Nazi Germany, or at least the basic bullet points of how it happened. And it's, so you don't need to recreate anything to do it. Just show some newsreel and people get the understanding of it. But it doesn't take you out of the movie. That's what's so remarkable about it.
Yes, we don't have that, like, the year is 1945 and Hitler is advancing on this. Those kind of cheesy things that we get with it. But you're right, like, we don't have that at all. But it's still, I think, and you mentioned this earlier about the movie that the Fox Searchlight chose to push was Jojo Rabbit. I can understand why.
Yeah, I can.
I mean, if from a money perspective, Jojo Rabbit's fun. It's good, but it kind of feeds you along the way. This is a movie I think that I could see with them being less comfortable. They're like, well, it's Malick, but at the same time, things like that. Yeah. Things like that aren't hitting you over the head, that aren't doing this. It's the subtlety of what they do. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were, because so Tree of Life, you have two very big Hollywood stars in there, objectively, or at least Pitt and Chastain in those kind of two main roles. But in this one, I feel like if you did anyone famous, it ruins the movie. Yeah. Like at least like Hollywood famous. I feel like the subtlety in their faces and stuff is just.
And the thing is, it's like and that reminds me of when Schindler's List came out, and they were talking about like all of the Hollywood actors who wanted to play Oscar Schindler. It's like, yeah, you can see why those actors wanted to play the role. None of them would have been right for it. It had to be somebody people weren't familiar with at the time, like Liam Neeson. And it's like, so. I mean, you can't imagine you can see big name actors being in this, but you also, they wouldn't have necessarily been as believable with the accents. And I think that's key.
That too.
Because I think you do have to have sort of, for a movie like this to truly be successful, you do need people who at least sound like they're from that area. And I think, because otherwise it's like, I mean, and that's, But at the same time, you have the British accents in Schindler's List, but you don't think about it because it's like that's kind of traditionally how Hollywood's done that. But yeah, no, it's easy to see why. Well, it's easy for every reason why Jojo Rabbit was the one that they pushed, because of the fact that on top of everything that you said, it's also Taika Waititi coming off of a Marvel movie. And so he was
and you've got ScarJo in it too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So but at the same time, it's like it's interesting. I love the idea of people. I do kind of love the fact that this is a movie that people are going to, as they start to their movie, as they start figuring out movies, that they like. I love the idea that they would come to Malick at a certain point, whether it's the New World, whether it's the Tree of Life, whether it's the Thin Red Line, and then they'll get to this one and they'll go, "Oh my God, where's this movie been?" And this was a movie, like, I knew I had to own it. Like, the second that I knew I wanted to own it, because I just knew it had to be in my life, and it was a movie that meant so much to me at the time, and it still does. I still love this. I love this movie. I love how it goes about it, and it really gave me a new perspective on Malick that I hadn't had before. And I think that is, and it's what led me to reconsider Days of Heaven. It's what led me back to thinking about the Tree of Life. Well, maybe I'll think differently about it. It's like, I want to do this with the Thin Red Line. I want to do this with New World. I want to do this. I basically want to go back and see. It's like, maybe now that I'm older, and this is one of the things that I love about certain filmmakers. I mean, there are some filmmakers that, like, it's funny because Tarkovsky, I was a fan from minute one. The second I saw Stalker in the late 90s, as I was getting into film, I knew that filmmaker was going to be in my life for the rest of my life. It was that impactful. With Malick, it's like I didn't have that feeling with. And it's interesting that now that I'm older and that I've experienced more, now that it feels like, okay, now you're starting to get more into Malick. And it's like, it makes sense that you're more into Malick. And it's like, it's one of the great, it's one of the things that I love about being a movie lover. Because it's like, look, I love being introduced to great new movies as much as the next movie lover. I do. I also love when I go back and rewatch a movie after a number of years and realize I feel very differently about this movie than I did before. And usually, and yeah, sometimes that can be in a bad way, but often it's going to be in a good way. And it's like, and it was funny because of the fact that one of the filmmakers that I would put in this perspective of Tarkovsky, of Malick, in terms of filmmakers who are so fascinated in the spiritual, who are so fascinated in religion, not so much religion, but faith and spirituality, is Bergman. It's funny because when I first saw The Seventh Seal, I was like, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And I had, part of the reason was I had this preconceived notion in my head because I had always heard, it's about a knight who's playing chess with death. And it's something very different as you actually watch the movie. And I revisited it years later, and it's like, okay, now I get it. Now I get what he's doing. And by this point, I'm also much more of a Bergman fan. I'm much more on his radar because I love Wild Strawberries. I love his adaptation of The Magic Flute. I love Scenes of Marriage, Fanny Alexander. But, it's like, okay, now I understand what he's doing with this. I get it. So it's like, especially if you're a film goer, if you're a film lover and some of these movies don't necessarily hit you, that's why I think going back to them is helpful. I mean, you always want to be looking forward in movies, in art, in what is coming out now, but at the same time, I think, there's always value in a rewatch. And I think with Malick, Malick has started to be rewarded with that, and he's one of those filmmakers that he really is truly special in a way that I didn't necessarily have an appreciation for when I first was introduced to him.
Well, I feel like, come on, Brian, this is like, you're making this way more spiritual than we were even trying to go down the road for, because it almost feels like what you're saying is like, it's kind of like, I wasn't ready for the film yet.
Yeah.
It's almost like I needed to be in a place where I was ready to be able to experience this film in a certain way. And I think that speaks to the beautiness of Malick, and the fact of when he speaks of things like spirituality, he does it with very hands off.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm going to put out ideas that I feel like are very deeply human, that you may connect with being spiritual. But with this, I trust you, the viewer, enough that I know that you're going to connect with it in the way that you need to.
Yeah.
In that kind of a way, as opposed to, like we mentioned earlier, like a lot of really bad Christian cinema doesn't trust you, which is very religious. No. We don't trust you. We need to tell you because whatever you're thinking is wrong. So it's very different. Like we are on the very end of the scale with this one, to where one's about trust. And I think a good artist should trust his audience to hopefully get him.
And for the record, we're on God's Not Dead 4, and it's coming out in October.
I know. I'm so excited. Not really at all. Judge Janine's in it. Judge Janine Pirro from Fox News is starring in it.
Oh, so God.
That's
Lord. No, going to what you just said, though, it reminds me, to tie it into another conversation we had way back, it reminds me of the scene in Dogma where Serendipity, Salma Hayek's character, is talking to Bethany, and she's like, none of the big religions have it right. And it's like, it's not about believing specific things. It's like, it's not saying, oh, you have to believe exactly in this. It's not. You want to have a good idea, and ultimately, it's about trusting. It's about faith. It's basically about faith, and it's about trusting. Like you said, it's about trusting in filmmaker not to allow you to figure it out for yourself. And I mean,
and as we see Franz in this, I mean, that is it's. I feel like it should be the heart of what you would hope religion would be, even though it's not. This idea that he's so committed to the idea of doing what is right. You would think that would be like the utmost of high, like this is where we want to all be. Like we want to just do the right thing, and and we don't.
It's like I am. It's like we've talked about this several times. I am not overly religious myself. I mean, I consider myself spiritual but not religious, but it's like I know enough people who've had that difficult moment where they realized that basically everything that they were told is bullshit for one reason or another. And they had to make a choice between themselves or the community that they were a part of. And it's not an easy choice. It really is not. And I mean, that's ultimately another thing that Malick is showing us in this film.
No, I mean, that's actually what you've just articulated is what people call spiritual deconstruction. The idea when you get to a point as you're an adult, you begin to realize what's BS, and then you figure out what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and then kind of begin to move forward. But what does happen, like you had said, and very much the same thing happens in this film, whether a spiritual community or church community, when you decide to leave, that you need to do something different, they kind of act just like they do in the movie. Where it's just like, you're convicting us. I don't like what you're doing. And the best way to say it is, you're bad. That keeps it off my conscience. I don't have to worry about myself. I just need to demonize you. And it makes me feel better. That's religion in a nutshell.
And on that note, I feel like that, but no, I mean, if you haven't if you haven't seen The Tree of Life or A Hidden Life, I mean, we cannot recommend them enough. I think I can speak for Stuart after this discussion in saying that these are just tremendous films. I mean, I understand that Malick's not everybody's cup of tea, but at the same time, I think he, especially in these two films, I think he's firing on all cylinders as a filmmaker, certainly, but also as a philosopher and as a storyteller. And sometimes I think that's as valuable of something to take away from films as just an entertaining experience.
I think you've said that absolutely beautifully well with that too. And and even looking, you made me look back. I had to look. I was trying to figure out how old he was now. So he's like 77. So I feel like even how we've discussed him, it's odd being able to see an artist like also grow.
Yeah.
We're seeing his skills grow, not just like in a technical sense, but more in like a ideological or metaphysical kind of narrative fix. So it is interesting to see how he's experimented and now kind of honed his craft into an interesting place.
Well, and it was fascinating because of the fact that he had 20 years where he just didn't make movies. He was working on things, he was coming up with ideas, but he just didn't make movies. So when he came back for Thin Red Line, it was a big deal. And, at the time, I was like, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And it's like, I loved, it's funny because it's like this was at that period where I was really very much, I was very much into Hans Zimmer at the time. So I got a soundtrack before I even saw the movie because I'm like, it's Hans Zimmer, I'm going to love it. And it was unlike anything he had ever done before. And so it was interesting to watch the movie and go, this is, I'm not quite sure how I feel about this. But I mean, and it's like this is one of the reasons why I'm curious to go back to it, because it's like I'm still not sure how I'm going to feel about it, but at the same time, I think I'm definitely going to appreciate it a bit more what he does, and I think it's because of the fact that now I'm more familiar with him, and I can sort of separate my feelings on, oh well, this is going to be a war film. I kind of know what that's going to look like. Well, now I know what a Malick film looks like, and so this is kind of where we're going to be. So I'm curious to see how I can look at it through that perspective as opposed to the perspective of somebody who just thought they knew what war films were about.
That's a good point. When did it come out? Was it Thin Red Line?
Well, it also came out the same. It came out in '98, so it was the same year as Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
So
I think I went from Private Ryan to even trying to view Thin Red Line and being like a little confused at what was going on. But I think I was again back in the days of like I still need to be spoon fed.
Yeah.
I still need to be spoon fed. But you're right. I think it'd be interesting to see that. And it's also interesting to see when you get actors like Sean Penn that in the Thin Red Line is, the idea that you can see the trust. Somehow he trusted Malick enough to kind of step back into something even more different years later down the line.
Definitely. And it's been great to, Stuart, it's been great to talk to you again. It's been a couple of years, and we'll definitely try it. We'll definitely. I definitely hope we'll talk again sometime in the near future.
Absolutely, man. Love to do this again. It's always fun.
Where can people find Snarky Faith?
Well, you can just look up. It's www.snarkyfaith.com. Look at Snarky Faith anywhere you listen to podcasts, etc. We're on Facebook, Twitter, all the other places too. So you can feel free to look me up, stalk me, whatever you need to do. It's the internet.
And it's a really it's an entertaining as well as an enlightening listen. It was so fun to be on there talking about Christian movies a few years ago, and it's been great to continue that discussion. But it was also great to have Stuart on for this discussion because of the fact that even though we're not specifically talking about religious films in the same way we were talking about the Passion of the Christ or the Omega Code or any of the dreck that we were talking about on Snarky Faith, at least this still works within the realms of a spiritual film and a film that deals with faith and spirituality in a way that is almost more honest than a lot of those films approach it. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with him. So, yeah, thank you again for joining me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, man.
I'd like to thank Stuart for joining me on the podcast today. It was wonderful to catch up for a little bit, as well as to talk to him about the work of Terrence Malick, and in particular these two films. That's going to do it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. Check us out on patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Also, check out, subscribe, and rate and review the podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel, as well as my written work at www.sonic-cinema.com. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.